I used to think loneliness was quiet, but it turns out it's the opposite. It's loud, deafening. It hums through the walls of your own home. It clangs in the silverware drawer. It taps at your window while you're brushing your teeth. That day, it was in the click of the classroom door behind me, in the rustle of jackets, in the faint thud of students dropping into chairs, as if their bodies were heavier than their minds. I stepped to the front of the lecture hall, clutching my notes not because I needed them, but because it gave my hands something to do. Dozens of eyes, half-lidded with disinterest, blinked back at me. A few glances flicked down toward glowing phones. One yawned, too. It was always like this at 2:30, except for one. He sat in the front row, same seat every week. He didn't fidget. He didn't whisper. He didn't glance down. Elias Monroe watched me as if I were saying something that mattered, and that, God help me, was all it took to undo me. I cleared my throat, pretending not to see the way his head tilted, just slightly, as I spoke. Let's try something different today. A few students stirred. I could feel them waking up, sensing I was about to break script. I let my eyes skim the room. I paused on Elias a beat too long. His gaze held mine. What? I asked, letting the words drop slowly. Are the psychological forces behind society's discomfort with age-discrepant relationships? Someone laughed under their breath. I smiled like I didn't notice. But I did. Sarah, a sharp-tongued redhead who made eye contact like it was a weapon, raised her hand. Well, she said with a smirk, maybe because people assume someone's getting something out of it, something they couldn't get elsewhere. There were chuckles. A few turned toward me, gauging my reaction. I forced a polite smile. Interesting point, I replied. So you're suggesting there's an assumed imbalance. Maybe one partner is compensating for something missing. Exactly, Sarah said, leaning back. Power, status, experience. People love to speculate. I nodded. Anyone else? Another hand, then another. I fielded the responses, laughed where I should, nodded where I could. But my attention kept drifting back to Elias. He hadn't spoken, hadn't moved, until I said his name. Elias. He blinked, as if surfacing a pause, a clearing of the throat. I think, he began, voice quieter than expected. People don't like imagining what they don't understand, especially when it challenges their idea of control. The room went still. Sometimes it's not about what's missing, he continued, eyes flicking toward mine, but about what someone finally finds, someone who sees them. He stopped, looked down at his hands. And in that moment, my breath caught, not because of what he said, but because it was exactly what I'd been starving to hear. I used to think being seen was the same as being loved. That as long as someone noticed your presence, your voice, the way your hands trembled when you were trying too hard to appear calm, it meant something. But I've been noticed all my life. Students have scribbled my words into notebooks for years. Colleagues nod at me in corridors. My husband says my name every night when he turns off the light. None of it has ever felt like being seen. Not really. It was a Tuesday. The sky outside was a blank gray, typical for early October in London. I walked into the lecture hall, balancing my notes and my travel mug, the lukewarm taste of burnt coffee still in my mouth. Dozens of students already waited inside, their faces a mix of fatigue and polite disengagement. Phones glowed beneath desks. A couple of boys in the back whispered and laughed under their breath. One girl was staring out the window with a kind of wistful longing I used to understand. I adjusted my blazer, stepped behind the lectern, and began the same way I always did. Today, we continue our discussion on social perception and relationship bias. A few pens moved, most eyes remained dull. I let my gaze pass over the rows. It was an old habit, sweeping the room not to check attendance, but to find him front row. Third seat from the left, Elias Monroe, 24, graduate student, psychology focus, polite, quiet, sharp, not in a showy way, but in that unnerving, still waters run deep kind of way. He watched me, every time, not with infatuation, not with challenge, just presence. It rattled me more than I cared to admit that day. I don't know what made me do it. Maybe the light outside, maybe the itch under my skin, maybe the way my name had sounded so empty that morning when Michael said it. I put my notes aside. How many of you, I asked, have ever judged a relationship just based on the age gap? A few chuckles, a murmur of interest. I continued. Let's explore that. What do you think are the underlying psychological factors behind society's discomfort with age-discrepant relationships? Heads turned. I felt the first flicker of alertness in the room. Even the girl near the window blinked and looked toward me. Sarah Penner, one of my more vocal students, raised her hand with the confidence of someone about to make mischief. Because people think it's not really love, she said. They think someone is being used or getting something they wouldn't get otherwise. Laughter, low and knowing, I let a smile curl at the edge of my lips. Interesting, I said. You're suggesting the imbalance isn't just in age, but in what each person is perceived to gain. Sarah shrugged with a grin. Just saying, if a 50-year-old is dating a 20-year-old, people assume money or daddy issues, not soulmates. More laughter, I nodded slowly. Fair enough, let's go deeper. I turned slightly, my eyes fell on him. Still seated the same way, still watching. Elias. He blinked once, sat forward, barely. There was a pause, a subtle shift in the room's energy. I think, he began, voice quieter than the others. People are afraid of what they don't think they deserve, especially when it's honest. The room hushed. They assume the older person has the upper hand, that it's about control. But sometimes, he paused, eyes searching mine. Sometimes it's just about being seen and wanting to stay there a little longer than is comfortable. Silence. He looked down as if the floor had tugged at him. My throat tightened. I could feel the way the moment settled between us like dust. Light barely there, but impossible not to notice once it landed. "Thank you," I said, voice softer. "That's insightful." The rest of the class passed in fragments. I don't remember what theories I covered or who else raised their hand. I only remember the way Elias had spoken, not about romance, not about sex, about recognition. When the bell rang, students packed their bags and slipped out. I stayed behind, straightening the notes I hadn't used. He walked past, didn't speak, but he looked at me. And in that look, I felt the breath leave me, not from desire, from the ache of being seen for the first time in what felt like years. The house was quiet when I stepped inside. It always was. Our street in North London had that gentle hush of aging neighborhoods, cars parked in the same spots for years, hedges trimmed out of habit, not pride inside. The air held a kind of stillness that didn't soothe. It suffocated. I slipped off my shoes and walked through the front hall. The light was dim, filtered through pale curtains that hadn't been changed in a decade. I could hear the faint rustle of newspaper pages and the distant hum of the television. Michael was in his usual spot. The recliner had molded to his shape over time, soft leather worn at the arms, a side table stacked with unread books and half-drunk mugs of tea. He glanced up, offered a small nod. Hey, I replied, setting my bag down near the door. He looked back at the paper, flipping a page without reading it. "How was your day?" I stirred the silence with a breath. It was interesting. His brow lifted slightly, but his eyes stayed on the print. Had a lively discussion in class. "That's good," he murmured, already gone again. I stood there a moment longer, watching the back of his head, the gray at his temples, the slump in his shoulders. We'd been together 26 years, married for 23. Love had been replaced by something quieter, a contract of cohabitation, respectful routine. I moved into the kitchen and began preparing dinner. The vegetables were soft from the fridge, the cutting board worn thin in the center. Each slice echoed in the empty room. At some point, Michael shuffled in behind me. "Need help?" he asked, out of habit more than intent. "I'm okay," I said, not turning. He lingered a moment. Then, with a soft grunt, moved toward the television. I wanted to tell him about Elias, about the question, about the silence in that classroom, and the voice that broke it open. But instead I said, "We talked about age gap relationships today." He let out a half laugh from the living room. "Bit of a risky topic, isn't it?" I smiled faintly to myself. Apparently not for them. They had plenty to say. There was no response. I stirred the pan, but my mind was no longer on the food. I saw Elias' face again. The way his eyes darkened when he thought, the hesitancy in his voice, like every word had been weighed carefully before he let it go. The house smelled of garlic and cumin. But what I felt beneath that was something else. A strange heat, not of desire, not yet, but of presence. It lingered in the space where thought met instinct, where memory blurred into possibility. I called Michael for dinner. He came, as always, quietly. We ate in silence, the only sound the clink of cutlery on ceramic. Across from me, he chewed slowly, reading something on his phone. I studied him the way you might study a piece of furniture you once loved, trying to remember why it mattered. He looked up once, caught my eye. "You all right?" I nodded. "Yeah, just tired." Later that night, we lay in bed, side by side, not touching. He fell asleep within minutes. His breath steady, predictable. I stared at the ceiling. I thought about the look Elias had given me, not of longing, but of recognition. That maybe, just maybe, he saw something I didn't know was still there. And I wasn't sure if that made me feel guilty or grateful. It was nearly 5 when I heard the knock on my office door, a soft, hesitant sound. I glanced at the clock. Most students had already gone, spilling into cafes and buses, and the early blur of London's dusk. I stood, expecting a forgotten paper or a last-minute question about grades. But when I opened the door, Elias stood there. His hands were in his pockets, his shoulders slightly hunched, as if he'd practiced what to say, but still wasn't sure he should say it. "Professor Halstead," he murmured, "Elias." I stepped aside and nodded. "Come in." He moved quietly, eyes flicking over the bookshelves, the window, the chair in front of my desk, avoiding me until he sat. I closed the door, sat down, tried not to feel the shift in air between us. "What's on your mind?" He cleared his throat, then again. I was wondering if I could ask for some extra help tutoring. That surprised me. He'd never been the student who needed it. "I've tried working with other study groups," he added quickly, "but I just get distracted. I can't focus." I waited, let him speak. "I think I'd do better if it was one-on-one." His eyes met mine for the briefest moment. "With you?" A silence settled. I nodded slowly. "All right, I'm happy to help." He sat a little straighter, a flicker of something relief maybe crossed his face. "I know professors aren't supposed to tutor privately without approval or payment," he said, "but I'd like to pay you. I want it to feel official." "That won't be necessary." "But I want to," he said. "Please." The way he said it, gentle but insistent, left no room for polite refusal. I folded my hands together. "When were you thinking?" "Evenings are best, after lectures. I could come to your place, if that's okay." My heart gave the faintest tremor. I forced my voice steady. "All right, we'll try that." I gave him my address, wrote it on a slip of paper, and handed it to him. He held it with both hands, as if it meant more than just directions. "Thank you," he said, "of course." He stood, hesitating at the door, then offered a small, almost shy smile. "I really appreciate this." When he left, I sat there longer than I needed to. I told myself it was nothing, just a favor for a student, just an evening session to help someone focused, sincere. But the truth was already blooming in the quiet. I felt it in my chest, in the way I opened my calendar and cleared a space that hadn't been there before. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the way he'd said "with you," not like a question, not like a plea, but like a choice. And somehow, that made all the difference. The doorbell rang at exactly 7. I'd been watching the clock for 30 minutes, pretending not to. The house was quiet, except for the kettle whistling faintly in the kitchen. I moved quickly down the hall, smoothing my sweater, hoping my face didn't betray the nerves beneath it. Michael called from the living room without turning his head. "Someone here for you." "Thanks," I said, my voice carefully even. He didn't ask who. But I felt the tension in the air as I passed. Not anger, not yet, just a dull resistance, like something under pressure. Elias stood on the porch, shoulders hunched slightly against the cold. He wore a navy jumper, the collar of a button-up peeking out underneath. "Evening," he said softly. I stepped aside. "Come in." He crossed the threshold, gaze shifting briefly around the hallway. There was a formality to him tonight, a quiet restraint. We walked past the living room. Michael didn't speak, just flicked through the television with slow, deliberate movements. I led Elias to the guest room we'd set up as my home office. "Sorry," I said as we entered. "The house isn't usually this quiet. It's fine," he interrupted gently. "I'm fine." He took a seat, placing his notebook neatly on the desk. I sat opposite, not too close. "I thought we could start with some of the more conceptual frameworks," I said. "Stuff that goes beyond exam prep, if that's okay." He nodded. "I'd like that." I opened a book. We began with theory attachment styles, social scripts, the development of early emotional imprints. At first, it felt like any other academic conversation, notes, definitions, examples. But slowly, something shifted. His questions became more personal, his tone softer. "What do you think makes a person stay in something that doesn't grow?" he asked at one point. I hesitated. "They don't want to start over," I said. "Or maybe they think they've already had their one chance." He looked at me for a long second, then down at his notebook again. There was something in that pause, a space where neither of us filled the silence. And yet, everything felt louder. I reached for another text. "We could talk about taboo dynamics," I said. "The way society frames what's appropriate, who's allowed to want whom." His gaze lifted slowly. "I've been thinking about that," he said. "How attraction doesn't really ask permission." "No," I said quietly. "It doesn't." He leaned back slightly, eyes searching mine. "It's strange, isn't it? How sometimes the safest places feel the most dangerous." I swallowed, my voice thinner than before. "Because we lower our guard there." He didn't reply, but the look in his eyes did. There was no touch, no declaration. Just a stillness between us, charged and unspoken. A current that didn't need wires to exist. When the clock struck 8:30, I closed the book. "That's probably enough for tonight." He stood, gathering his things slowly, no rush. At the door, he paused. "Thank you," he said, "for the session." I nodded. "You can call me Claire, outside class, anyway." A faint smile tugged at the edge of his mouth. "All right, Claire." And with that, he left. I stood in the room long after the sound of the door had faded. Everything in the house was still. But inside me, something had begun to shift, not like a decision, more like a door slowly creaking open. And I didn't know yet if I'd walk through it, only that I hadn't closed it. The following week passed with a strange kind of weight. Nothing had happened, not in the technical sense. But something had shifted. Elias returned on Thursday, same time, same soft knock at the door. I opened it before Michael could say a word. He gave Elias a glance this time, not rude, not friendly, just long enough to mean something. Elias offered a quiet nod in return, then followed me through the hallway, his steps soundless on the wood floor. We sat in the guest room again, books spread out between us, but neither of us touched them for a while. "How was your week?" I asked. He shrugged lightly. "Long." I smiled. "I know the feeling." This time, we didn't dive into theory immediately. Instead, we circled around it. We talked about memory, about how people remember feelings more than facts, how sometimes a single look can stay with you longer than a whole year of conversation. He listened closely. I could see it in the way his brows drew together slightly, as if trying to hold something steady inside. When we finally began working, his concentration faltered. He kept glancing at my hands, then away, then back again. At one point, I reached for a pen near him, and our fingers nearly brushed. We both paused. The pen rolled to the floor, unnoticed. The silence afterward wasn't awkward. It was dense, filled with something unnamed. "Claire," he said quietly, "can I ask you something?" I looked at him carefully, of course. His voice lowered, as though afraid the walls might listen. "What do you think makes someone want something they know they shouldn't?" I didn't answer right away, not because I didn't know, but because the honesty would cost more than I was ready to pay. "When something feels like it sees you," I said eventually, "you want to stay near it, even if you're not supposed to." He nodded slowly. His eyes held mine a moment longer. I felt the air between us narrow, not with threat, with invitation. The edge of something we were both circling, unspoken. But there, real after he left, I stood by the window and watched him walk down the drive. The house felt colder, emptier that weekend. The university hosted a faculty gathering, small, casual, half-hearted. I didn't want to go, but Michael insisted. We arrived just after 6. Wine, cheese, small talk, people pretending to be relaxed. I saw Elias across the courtyard before he saw me. He was speaking to a few peers, his back straight, hands in his pockets, posture calm. When he turned and noticed me, his face didn't change, but his eyes did. Michael noticed it too. I felt his body stiffen slightly beside me. "Who's that?" he asked. "Graduate student," I replied. "Bright." Michael didn't speak for a long beat, then nodded, like he was filing something away. We didn't stay long. At home, he didn't mention it again, but I could feel his questions gathering like clouds. Later that night, I sat on the edge of the bathtub, the faucet dripping in steady rhythm. I thought about Elias' voice, his stillness, the way he looked at me without reaching for anything. And I realized something I hadn't admitted until then. It wasn't desire that unsettled me. It was the feeling of being known. and I didn't know yet whether that was something I wanted to resist or surrender to. It was raining that night, not heavily, just enough to blur the world through the windows. I'd lit a candle on the desk, more for comfort than light. The room smelled faintly of bergamot and old paper. Elias arrived 5 minutes early. He didn't knock this time. Michael opened the door, then called toward the hall. "Claire, he's here." His voice was clipped, short. I came downstairs slowly, towel still wrapped around my damp hair. Elias stood awkwardly in the entrance, coat dripping. "Sorry," he said. "Didn't mean to." "No, it's all right, come in." Michael lingered longer this time. His eyes passed between us. "Bit late for tutoring, isn't it?" he asked. I didn't flinch. "Just one session. He's behind on a few chapters." Michael muttered something and disappeared into the living room. The sound of the TV rose slightly. As if on cue, I led Elias down the hallway. But instead of the guest room, I turned toward the back. The study was too close to Michael tonight, too exposed. The master bedroom was quiet, dimly lit, warm. Elias paused in the doorway, his voice uncertain. "Here," I nodded once. "It's the only place we won't be overheard." He stepped inside, slowly looked around, then sat at the edge of the bed. I joined him, a notebook in my lap. Though neither of us opened it, I began speaking softly, calmly, about transference, about projection, about the way the mind attaches meaning to what it longs for. He listened, but I could feel his focus pulling toward something else, not physical, not spoken, something that hung in the air like static before a storm. Our words slowed, then stopped. The silence filled in the spaces like water rising in a glass. I turned to him. There was no invitation in my expression, only truth. He looked at me as if he'd spent days standing outside a locked door, and now it was cracked open. His voice was barely there. "I didn't really come to study." My breath caught, not from shock, but recognition. He exhaled. "I just wanted to be near you." There it was, the thing we'd both been walking around carefully, quietly, a truth soft as breath, heavy as gravity. I reached forward slowly, not to touch him, but to bridge the space between what was said and what was felt. And in that moment, something shifted, not in our bodies, in the air, in the pull of the world around us. A current passed through, warm, electric, unnameable. It moved like light under skin, like breath drawn into lungs that had been waiting too long to feel full. His eyes closed, not in retreat, but surrender. No hands reached, no names whispered, just the quiet collapse of two walls finally letting go. A stillness spread between us, but it wasn't the kind that suffocates. It was the kind that says you're safe, you're seen. When I opened my eyes, the room hadn't changed, but I had. He stood slowly, brushing the edge of the notebook still in his lap. I should go. I walked him to the door. Michael didn't look up from the sofa, but his silence burned hotter than any words might have. Elias paused at the threshold. "Thank you." "For what?" I asked. He hesitated, then smiled, faint and full. for not pretending. And then he stepped into the night, rain falling lightly onto his shoulders. And I stood there, not ashamed, not afraid, but finally aware of what I'd done and what I could no longer undo. I didn't see him for days. No messages, no visits, no knocks at the door. I told myself it was good. That space was what we needed. Michael had grown quiet in a way that wasn't passive anymore. He watched me when he thought I wasn't looking. He moved around the house like someone waiting for confirmation of what they already knew. One morning, I came down to find the kettle still warm and 2 mugs on the counter, both untouched. I stood there, staring at them, wondering how many small silences had led us here. At the university, I taught as usual lectures, meetings, polite nods in the hallway, but everything felt muted. Then, on a Thursday afternoon, I opened the submissions for a weekly reflection essay. One paper caught my eye before I even clicked. The title was simple: On Power, Distance, and the Illusion of Control. It was Elias's. I opened it. At first, it read like any other well-structured argument, case studies, theories, cultural analysis. But then, near the midpoint, the voice shifted. It became personal, unflinchingly so. Sometimes the person who holds the power isn't the older one. It's the one who dares to feel without armor, the one who steps closer when they know they'll be pushed away. I didn't breathe for several lines. His words weren't dramatic. They didn't beg. They simply existed, like stones laid on the ground, leading to something neither of us had the courage to name. I sat back, closed the laptop. The walls around me felt too close, the desk too cluttered, my own body too full of things I hadn't let myself process. That night, Michael didn't ask about my day, and I didn't offer it. We moved past each other like ghosts in the kitchen, 2 people in the same house, occupying different dimensions. Later, alone in the bedroom, I opened my phone. I hesitated, then typed 3 words. I read it. The message was seen immediately. No reply came until 20 minutes later. A voice message I put in my headphones. He didn't say my name. He just spoke. I meant every word, not to change anything, just so you'd know I meant them, even if nothing comes of it. Even if this was all it ever was, I needed you to know what it meant to be seen like that by you. I listened twice. The second time, I closed my eyes. And for the first time in days, I cried not from guilt, but from the unbearable tenderness of being understood, the kind that makes you ache, not because it hurts, but because it reached a place inside you that had gone untouched for far too long. I invited him on a Sunday, not with a plan, just a message. If you want to talk, I'll be home after 3. He didn't reply, but at 3:12, there was a knock, quiet, almost unsure. I opened the door and there he was, no coat, just a sweater and jeans. Hands in his pockets again. He looked different somehow, not older, not younger, just clearer. We didn't speak as I let him in. The house was quiet, like it had been holding its breath. Michael wasn't there. He'd gone to visit his sister 2 towns over. He hadn't said goodbye. Elias followed me to the kitchen. I made tea without asking. He stood beside the table, watching the steam rise from the mugs. When we sat, it wasn't across from each other. It was side by side, like people who no longer needed to measure distance. We talked about nothing at first, books, weather, a paper deadline. But then the pauses grew longer, and the words thinner. I stared into my cup. Have you ever loved someone quietly, so quietly it didn't feel like love until it started to hurt? He didn't answer, just looked at me. That was enough. I don't know what this is, I said, and I don't think I want to name it, but I know I don't regret it. The air shifted. I don't either, he said. There was no fire in his voice, just warmth. The kind that melts rather than burns. We stayed like that for a while, tea growing cold, the clock ticking too softly to matter. Upstairs, a suitcase stood half-packed in the bedroom. Michael's coat was gone from the hook. The drawer with his documents had been emptied. He hadn't spoken a word, but he'd spoken enough. I didn't chase after him. I didn't reach out. The version of us we'd built had been fading for years. Maybe he just waited for me to admit it first. Elias touched the rim of his mug. I thought if I stayed away, it'd go away, he said. But I couldn't stop thinking about that night, not because of what almost happened, but because it felt like something opened. It did, I whispered. We didn't touch, not once. But something passed between us, a quiet agreement, a shared truth, that even if this ended here, we had crossed into something that wouldn't let us return unchanged. And neither of us was sorry. I met him in the arboretum behind the university, late afternoon. The light was soft, filtered through bare branches and thinning clouds. We hadn't spoken since that Sunday. No messages, no meetings. But when I asked if he'd come, he said yes, immediately, as if he'd already been waiting for the invitation. He was sitting on a bench near the eastern path, where the ivy climbed up the old stone wall. I saw him before he saw me, and I hesitated watching the way he sat, spine straight, hands folded in his lap. There was something quiet about him, but never weak. He looked up when I approached. I sat beside him without a word for a while. We just watched the wind shift the leaves. I used to come here to think, I said, years ago, when I was a student. He nodded. It's the only place on campus that feels like time doesn't matter. We fell into silence again. When he spoke, it was with care. I've been trying to make sense of what this is, of what it means, if it means anything. It does, I said, but maybe not in the way either of us expected. He turned slightly toward me, and I saw the question in his eyes. Not what do you want from me, but what do you want for yourself, I exhaled. My life was built on quiet compromise, on doing the right thing, or at least the expected thing. I know, he said gently. And you interrupted that. His mouth twitched, not into a smile, into understanding. I didn't mean to. I know. A breeze moved through the trees above us. I'm not asking for anything, he said. Not more time, not more answers. I just needed to know if I was alone in what I felt. You weren't. truth settled between us, calm as breath. I looked at him, really looked, and I realized what I'd been avoiding. This wasn't about whether we continued, whether we dared more. It was about the door he'd opened to my own heart, to the parts of myself I'd buried under years of resignation. He stood first, brushed his hands together. I rose with him. He didn't reach for me, didn't ask, didn't press. But before we turned away, I said quietly, "If I never said it, thank you." "For what?" he asked. "For reminding me I still feel." He smiled then, soft, sad, grateful. "You do," he said, "more than most." And with that, we walked in opposite directions. No goodbye, just the echo of something that had been true and always would be. Spring came quietly, without announcement. Just a soft shift in the air. The days grew longer, the light warmer, and still no word from Elias. But I didn't wait, not in the way I might have before. Instead, I moved through my days with a different rhythm, slower, clearer. I taught the final weeks of term with something close to calm. Not because everything had resolved, but because I had, in early May, I sat down in my office and wrote my resignation letter. 7 lines, no embellishments. I handed it to the dean the following Monday. He looked surprised, but not shocked. I didn't explain. He didn't ask. Some things don't need justification. At home, Michael's absence had become the new silence, not a rupture, just a room that no longer echoed. I cleared drawers, donated books, let go of clothes I hadn't worn in years, not out of grief, but relief. Then, one evening, as I was locking the front door, I noticed a small envelope on the mat. No name, no stamp. Inside was a single sheet of paper typed simple. Stillness doesn't mean silence. It means choosing where the noise ends. No signature, but I knew. I sat down on the stairs, letter still in hand. The world outside was quiet, not hollow, just honest. I closed my eyes, and in that moment, I realized something. We weren't a story that ended. We were a story that changed its shape, not a love lost, but a truth kept. And sometimes, that's the better ending. One where no one owns the other. One where the ache becomes peace. I folded the letter, tucked it into a book I'd never loan out, and walked into the stillness, not to escape it, but to belong to it.